Is Trump behaving like a dictator? That's a big loaded question, the kind that makes you spit out your lukewarm coffee in a diner and start a very loud, very public argument with someone's uncle named Dale. And look, let's be clear, America under Trump wasn't suddenly goose-stepping to Nuremberg rallies. We weren't exactly rounding up dissidents and forcing them to make tiny hats for hamsters, but there were parallels. He has definitely shown some authoritarian tendencies, though he's not a full-fledged dictator. He still operated within a democracy, despite often clashing with its norms, but did he maybe, just maybe, try to test its limits? Let's look at some examples from Trump's behavior and compare them to actions by past dictators. Grab your tiny American flags and a healthy dose of skepticism, folks, because we're about to dive headfirst into the deep end of American politics. All right, let's talk about the press. Those brave souls who, try to hold power to account, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, all that jazz. Trump, however, had a slightly different term for them. The enemy of the people. Not exactly subtle, is it? This wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark. Trump repeatedly used this phrase, a phrase with a chilling historical resonance, echoing the rhetoric of Stalin, Mao, and, let's not forget, Hitler, who infamously used his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels to paint the media as liars and manipulators. And any news coverage Trump didn't like? Well, that was just fake news, of course. Convenient, isn't it? Just slap a label on it and boom, suddenly legitimate reporting is dismissed as fabricated nonsense. Of course, Trump wasn't the first to cry fake news. Dictators throughout history have used this tactic to discredit unfavorable coverage and sow distrust in any information that doesn't come directly from them. Control the narrative, control the people. It's a tale as old as time. Now, to be fair, Trump didn't shut down newspapers or send journalists to gulags. He operated within the bounds of the First Amendment, even if he seemed to regard it with the same fondness one might reserve for a particularly aggressive raccoon. But the constant attacks, the erosion of trust in a free press, the elevation of friendly outlets like Fox News, all of that had a chilling effect. Because when you convince people that the press can't be trusted, you create a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushes, well, whatever narrative you find most convenient. Let's talk about elections, shall we? Those quaint little exercises in democracy where, the people choose their leaders. Except when you're aspiring to be more of a dear leader than an elected official, well, those pesky elections can be a bit of an inconvenience. And Trump, from the get-go, seemed to have a rather fraught relationship with the concept of accepting election results. Remember 2016, when he refused to say whether he'd accept the outcome if he lost? Good times. Fast forward to 2020, and well, we all know how that party went down. The election was rigged, stolen, a fraudulent assault on democracy. Except it wasn't. Numerous recounts, audits and court cases, even those overseen by Trump-appointed judges, confirmed that Joe Biden won fair and square. But facts, as they often do, had a nasty habit of getting in the way of Trump's narrative. And so we got the big lie, the relentless and baseless claims of election fraud that culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Now, did Trump personally storm the Capitol building, clad in a horned headdress and wielding a Confederate flag? He did not, but his words, riddled with lies and inflammatory rhetoric, fueled the fire. He spent months laying the groundwork, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election, and when he lost, he urged his supporters to fight like hell. And fight they did in a chaotic and deadly display that shook the very foundations of American democracy. This, my friends, is straight out of the dictator's playbook. From Putin's Russia to Maduro's Venezuela, undermining faith in elections, suppressing dissent, and clinging to power by any means necessary is a tried and tested tactic. Let's be honest, folks, the man knows how to work a crowd. Those rallies, pure spectacle, a sea of red hats, chants of USA, USA, and at the center of it all, the Donald basking in the adulation like a spray-tanned deity descended from the heavens. And the message? Well, it was rarely about policy or ideology or anything as tedious as that. It was about him, his successes, his grievances, his enemies, both real and imagined. Loyalty to Trump became, for many, more important than loyalty to the Republican Party, to conservative principles, even to the country itself. Dissent was met with accusations of being a Reno, Republican in name only, a never-Trumper, a traitor to the cause. This, my friends, is what we call a cult of personality, and it's a tactic as old as dictatorship itself. Think Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, where his image was everywhere, his word was law, and any deviation from the party line was met with swift and brutal punishment. Or consider Franco's Spain, where loyalty to the Caudillo was paramount, and any whiff of dissent was ruthlessly crushed. Now, to be fair, Trump didn't have the power to unleash Red Guards or establish a totalitarian regime. He was, for all his bluster, operating within the constraints of a democratic system, but he understood the power of personality, of creating an emotional connection with his followers that transcended ideology or reason. He tapped into their anger, their fears, their sense of grievance, and offered himself as the solution, the savior, the only one who could make America great again. Chapter 4. With friends like these, Trump and the authoritarian fan club, you know what they say, you can tell a lot about a person by the company they keep. And when it came to world leaders, Trump seemed to have a particular fondness for the autocratic kind. Vladimir Putin, a strong leader. Kim Jong-un, a funny guy, very smart. Rodrigo Duterte, doing an amazing job. The man had a knack for complimenting dictators like he was handing out participation trophies at a preschool. It was almost endearing, in a deeply unsettling kind of way. Now, you might think that a US president, the leader of the free world and all that, would be a little more, shall we say, discerning in his praise, but Trump seemed to have a genuine admiration for these strongmen, these men who ruled with an iron fist, unconstrained by the pesky limitations of democracy or the rule of law. And why not? After all, these were men who got things done, who didn't have to deal with pesky things like a free press, an independent judiciary, or an opposition party that wasn't constantly trying to impeach them. They were the kind of leaders who could build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, or lock up their political opponents, or, invade neighboring countries without having to worry about pesky things like international condemnation or war crimes tribunals. And isn't that just neat? This admiration wasn't one-sided either. Authoritarian leaders around the world saw in Trump a kindred spirit, a man who spoke their language, who shared their disdain for democratic norms and institutions. They praised his strength, his decisiveness, his willingness to shake things up. They saw in him a potential ally, someone who might be willing to turn a blinder eye to their human rights abuses, their corruption, their assaults on democracy, and in some cases they were right. Chapter 5. Law and Order, Trump style, using law enforcement for personal gain. Now, we all know that Trump loves the phrase law and order. He's used it ad nauseum, often while simultaneously undermining the very institutions that uphold those principles. Because for Trump, law and order didn't mean upholding the rule of law, it meant using the levers of power to benefit himself and punish his enemies. And what better tool for this than the Department of Justice, that bastion of impartiality and blind justice? Except under Trump, the DOJ seemed to take on a slightly more partisan hue. Remember when he publicly demanded that the DOJ investigate Hillary Clinton? Or when he fired FBI Director James Comey for refusing to pledge loyalty and drop the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election? Or when he repeatedly called for investigations into Joe Biden and his son Hunter, based on nothing more than unsubstantiated allegations and right-wing conspiracy theories. These weren't the actions of a president who respected the independence of the judiciary. These were the actions of a man who saw the law as a weapon to be wielded against his enemies and a shield to protect himself and his allies. This, my friends, is classic authoritarian behavior. From Hitler's Gestapo to Stalin's NKVD, dictators throughout history have used their secret police forces to silence dissent, crush opposition, and maintain their grip on power. They understand that fear is a powerful motivator and that by controlling the instruments of law enforcement, they can control the population. Now, to be fair, Trump didn't have his own Gestapo, and the US justice system, while flawed, is still far more robust and independent than anything you'd find in a dictatorship. But his attempts to politicize the DOJ, to use it as a tool for personal and political vendettas, were deeply concerning. They were a dangerous erosion of democratic norms, a sign that he saw himself not as a servant of the people, but as their ruler, answerable to no one. Chapter 6. It's not you, it's me. Loyalty over competence. You know, in functional government, you'd think that competence would be a pretty important qualification for, well, any job really. But in Trump's world, competence was often secondary to a far more crucial factor: loyalty. Blind, unwavering, dog on a fire hydrant kind of loyalty. And if you weren't willing to kiss the ring, to pledge fealty to dear leader, well, you could find yourself out on your ear faster than you could say emoluments clause. The revolving door at the Trump White House spun so fast it practically generated its own weather system. Remember Jeff Sessions, Trump's own Attorney General, who had the audacity to recuse himself from the Russia investigation? Trump never forgave him for that perceived betrayal, publicly humiliating him, undermining his authority and ultimately forcing him out. Or how about James Comey, as we mentioned earlier, who made the fatal mistake of taking the FBI's motto of fidelity, bravery, integrity a little too seriously? Trump axed him too, in a move that reeked of obstruction of justice. And then there were the countless other officials, advisors and cabinet members who dared to disagree with the president, or worse, to criticize him publicly. They were branded as disloyal, nasty losers and promptly shown the door. This obsession with loyalty over competence is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. Dictators, by their very nature, are deeply insecure creatures. They surround themselves with yes men, with sycophants and enablers who are more interested in staying on the right side of power than in doing what's right. They create a culture of fear and paranoia where dissent is seen as treason, and any hint of independent thought is ruthlessly crushed. Now, to be fair, Trump's inner circle wasn't exactly the Politburo, and he never quite managed to achieve the level of totalitarian control over the US government that someone like Stalin enjoyed. But his constant purges, his demand for absolute loyalty, and his willingness to cast aside anyone who dared to question him, created a chaotic and dysfunctional environment where bad decisions were made, incompetence flourished, and the interests of the country were often secondary to the whims of the dear leader. Artro, so was he a dictator? So there you have it, the evidence laid bare for all to see. Did Donald Trump behave like a dictator? Well, he certainly seemed to have studied the playbook, the attacks on the press, the undermining of elections, the cult of personality, the praise for authoritarian leaders, the use of law enforcement for personal gain, the obsession with loyalty over competence. These are all hallmarks of authoritarianism. But there's a crucial difference between exhibiting authoritarian tendencies and actually being a dictator. Trump, for all his bluster and overreach, was ultimately constrained by the institutions of American democracy. He couldn't silence the press, rig the elections, or jail his opponents, no matter how much he might have wanted to. The courts, the military, the states, the civil service, the media, and yes, even his own party, all pushed back against his attempts to consolidate power. The system, battered and bruised, held. But it's a sobering thought, isn't it? That in the 21st century, in the supposed beacon of democracy, we even have to ask these questions, that a man who so clearly admired dictators, who so brazenly flouted democratic norms, could come so close to holding the reins of power.